Rawhide bites into Thomas's back. The 20th lash. Blood slicks the whipping post. Colonel Harrison watches, a flicker in his eye. The entire garrison assembled to witness this justice. Thomas tastes blood and salt, and the bitter knowledge that Ayanna's father is riding in, not for vengeance, but with an offer that will shatter everything. The leather bit deep into Thomas Brennan's back for the 20th time, and he still hadn't made a sound. Blood ran in rivulets down his spine, pooling at the base of the whipping post, where his wrists were bound with rope that had long since turned crimson. Colonel Harrison stood 10 paces away, his face a mask of military precision, though something flickered in his eyes each time the whip cracked through the morning air. The entire garrison had been assembled to witness this punishment. 200 men standing in perfect formation while their fellow soldier paid the price for defending a savage, as the charges read. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen her eyes that night 3 days ago, wide with terror as Sergeant Murphy and his cronies cornered her outside the supply tent. Ayanna wasn't a savage. She was barely 16, a Lakota girl who came to trade beadwork for flour and sugar, keeping her people fed through another harsh winter. The 21st lash landed with a wet sound that made several soldiers flinch. Thomas bit down on the leather strap between his teeth, tasting blood and salt, and the bitter knowledge that he'd do it all again. Murphy had been drunk, his hands grabbing where they shouldn't, his voice slurred with whiskey and hatred as he called her things that made Thomas's stomach turn. When she tried to run, Murphy's friends had blocked her path, their laughter echoing off the wooden buildings like the calls of carrying birds. Thomas hadn't weighed the consequences. He'd simply moved, his fist connecting with Murphy's jaw with a crack that silenced the laughter instantly. The fight that followed had been brief and bloody, leaving Murphy unconscious in the dirt, and Thomas facing court-martial for striking a superior officer. 22-23. The post shuddered with each impact, and Thomas felt consciousness wavering at the edges like heat shimmer. Through the haze of pain, he remembered Ayanna's face as she knelt beside him after the fight, her small hands pressing a torn piece of her dress against the cut above his eye. She'd whispered something in Lakota, words he didn't understand but felt in his bones anyway. Gratitude, maybe, or sorrow for what her rescue would cost him. When the military police had arrived to drag him away, she'd pressed something into his palm, a small carved bird, smooth and warm from her touch. It was still in his cell, waiting for him if he survived the next 8 lashes. The crowd stirred as the 24th lash fell. Someone was approaching from the main gate, the sound of hooves unmistakable even through Thomas's pain-fogged hearing. Colonel Harrison raised his hand and the whipping stopped mid-stroke. Thomas hung from his bonds, barely conscious, blood dripping steadily onto the packed earth. Through swollen eyes he saw riders entering the compound. Lakota warriors, 3 of them sitting their horses with the easy grace of men born to the saddle. The center rider was older, his hair star with silver, wearing a war shirt decorated with porcupine quills and bear claws. His face was weathered leather, lined with years of sun and sorrow, but his eyes were sharp as obsidian as they surveyed the scene before him. The soldiers' hands moved instinctively to their weapons, but Colonel Harrison's sharp command kept them at attention. This was Chief Iron Bear, Janna's father, a man who commanded respect even from his enemies. He'd ridden into an armed camp with only 2 warriors for company, which meant he'd come to talk, not fight. The chief's gaze found Thomas immediately, taking in the bloody back and the post stained red with suffering. For a moment, something passed across the older man's face, surprise perhaps, or recognition. Then his expression settled into the careful neutrality of a man conducting delicate negotiations. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified, and walked toward Colonel Harrison with measured steps. The colonel met him halfway, the 2 leaders facing each other across years of mistrust and warfare. When Iron Bear spoke, his English was careful but clear, each word chosen with the precision of a man who understood that lives hung on language. "My daughter told me of the soldier who stood for her against his own people," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent compound. "She told me of his courage and his price." Thomas felt the words like a physical thing, warm and solid against his chest. Janna had spoken of him to her father, had told the story of that night in ways that mattered. Iron Bear's eyes moved to Thomas again, studying the young man who hung bleeding from the punishment post. 30 lashes is the sentence. Colonel Harrison nodded stiffly. 30 lashes for striking a superior officer. Military justice, Chief Iron Bear, nothing personal. The chief's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Justice, he repeated as if tasting the word. White man's justice for defending a Lakota woman. This is interesting justice indeed. The tension in the compound ratcheted higher, every soldier waiting for the explosion that would turn words into bullets. But Iron Bear raised his hand in a gesture of peace, his voice remaining steady. 6 lashes remain. Yes, I ask that you wait. Give me this day to speak with my people, to think on what I have seen here. Harrison frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the delay, but something in the chief's manner gave him pause. Your daughter is safe, the colonel said carefully. She returned to your camp unharmed thanks to, he glanced at Thomas, a Private Brennan's intervention. Iron Bear nodded slowly. She is safe in body, but in heart, in spirit. These things take longer to heal. He looked around the compound at the assembled soldiers and their nervous faces at the post, where Thomas still hung barely conscious. My daughter speaks of honor among your people. She believes she has seen it in this young man's actions. I have come to see if she speaks truly. The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that made Harrison's jaw tighten. This wasn't just about punishment anymore. This was about something larger, more dangerous, the possibility of understanding between enemies. Iron Bear's words settled over the compound like morning mist, heavy with meaning that went far beyond the simple request for delay. Colonel Harrison found himself caught between military protocol and something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps the recognition that this moment held possibilities beyond punishment and bloodshed. The chief stood with the patience of stone, his weathered hands folded calmly while his dark eyes never left Thomas's battered form. Behind him, his 2 warriors remained mounted and motionless, their faces masks of controlled alertness that spoke of men ready for anything but hoping for peace. The silence stretched until Harrison finally nodded, his voice gruff with reluctant respect. Private Brennan will remain secured until tomorrow morning. The remaining lashes will be administered then, unless he left the sentence hanging, unsure himself what alternative he might be offering. Thomas barely registered the conversation through the haze of pain that clouded his thoughts. His back felt like liquid fire, each breath sending fresh waves of agony through his torn flesh. Blood had soaked through his uniform pants, and his wrists were raw from pulling against the ropes that held him upright. But somewhere in the fog of suffering, he heard Ayanna's name spoken with a tenderness that cut through everything else. Iron Bear was talking about his daughter, about honor and courage, about choices that mattered more than military regulations. Thomas tried to lift his head to show that he was still conscious, still present for whatever was unfolding around him. The effort sent sparks of darkness across his vision, but he managed to focus on the chief's face, seeing there something he hadn't expected. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of measuring respect that felt more valuable than gold. The chief stepped closer to the whipping post, close enough that only Thomas could hear when he spoke in low, careful English. My daughter sees your heart, young soldier. She speaks of eyes that hold no hatred, hands that protect instead of harm. She asked many questions about the man who chose pain over silence. Thomas's throat was too dry for speech, but he managed a slight nod, the movement sending fresh fire down his spine. Iron Bear studied his face for a long moment, then reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out a small object wrapped in soft doken and held it where Thomas could see. Inside the wrapping was the carved bird he'd given back to Ayanna that night, but now it hung from a delicate string of blue and white beads that caught the morning light like captured sky. She made this for the man who stood between her and shame, Iron Bear said quietly, but she fears to give it, fears that white soldiers do not accept gifts from Lakota women. She fears that honor might be punished twice. The words hit Thomas harder than any lash, filling him with an ache that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. Somewhere out there, Ayanna was worrying about him, creating something beautiful with her own hands while he hung bleeding for choices they'd both made in a single moment of crisis. He tried to speak, managed only a hoarse whisper that barely qualified as sound. Iron Bear leaned closer, and Thomas forced the words past cracked lips. Tell her. Tell her it was worth it. Every lash, every moment. She's worth everything. The chief's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise or approval or both. He straightened slowly, his gaze moving to Colonel Harrison, who had been watching the quiet exchange with growing unease. The tension in the compound was palpable now. Every soldier sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that might change the careful balance of hatred and fear that kept this corner of the frontier from exploding into open warfare. Iron Bear walked back to where Harrison waited, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the weapons trained on him from every angle. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the assembled troops, ensuring that every man would remember his words. Colonel Harrison, you are a man of war, but also a man of honor. I have seen this in how you conduct yourself, how you treat prisoners, how you keep your word even when it costs you. Harrison's face remained impassive, but Thomas saw the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the compliment had found its mark. Iron Bear continued, his tone formal but not unfriendly. My daughter has told me of the soldier who defended her honor at cost to his own body. She has told me of a man who chose justice over safety, who stood against his own people for the sake of what was right. These are not the actions of an enemy. These are the actions of a man whose heart walks in the light. The chief paused, letting the words sink in before delivering what everyone sensed was coming, the real reason for his presence here. In my culture, such actions create debts that must be honored. When a man risks everything to protect what is precious to a family, that family owes him consideration beyond mere gratitude. Harrison's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but Iron Bear raised his own hand in a gesture of peace. I do not speak of violence, Colonel. I speak of something far more dangerous to both our peoples. I speak of understanding. The words sent a ripple through the assembled soldiers, a murmur of confusion and concern that Harrison quickly silenced with a sharp look. Iron Bear reached into another pouch and withdrew a leather bundle tied with sinew and decorated with small shells that clinked softly in the morning breeze. He held it carefully, reverently, like a man handling something sacred. This belonged to my father and his father before him. It has been passed down through 7 generations of chiefs, used only in matters of greatest importance to our people. Thomas watched through pain-hazed eyes as the chief unwrapped the bundle, revealing what appeared to be a ceremonial pipe carved from red stone and decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water across its surface. The sight of it drew audible gasps from some of the soldiers who recognized its significance. This was no mere artifact, but a symbol of authority and spiritual power among the Lakota. I offered to smoke the pipe of peace with the soldier who defended my daughter, Iron Bear announced, his voice ringing across the compound with the authority of generations. I offer to make him family, to bind his honor to ours through the ancient ways of my people. The implications hit the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Marriage. The chief was offering his daughter in marriage to a white soldier, a union that would bridge 2 worlds that had known nothing but conflict for decades. Harrison's face went pale then red as he grappled with the enormous complications such an offer would create. Military regulations, government policies, the delicate balance of frontier politics, all of it threatened by an old man's gesture of respect for his daughter's protector. Thomas felt the world spinning around him, and not just from blood loss. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, he tried to process what he just heard. Marriage to Ayanna, the girl whose eyes had haunted his dreams for 3 nights, whose gentle touch had been the last kindness he'd experienced before they dragged him to this post. The carved bird with its blue and white beads seemed to burn against his palm where she'd pressed it, a promise of something he'd never dared imagine possible. But even as hope flared in his chest, practical considerations crashed down like an avalanche. He was a soldier in the United States Army, bound by regulations and oaths that forbade exactly this kind of alliance. Marriage to a Lakota woman would mean court-martial, discharge, exile from everything he'd known. Iron Bear seemed to read his thoughts, his weathered face softening with something that might have been paternal understanding. I know the cost, young soldier. I know what choosing my daughter would mean for your life among the whites, But I also know what choosing honor has already cost you, and I see that you do not regret the price." The chief's eyes moved to the blood-soaked post, then back to Thomas's battered face. "My daughter dreams of eyes that hold no hatred. She dreams of hands that protect instead of harm. She dreams of a man who would choose suffering over silence, who would risk everything for what is right. She dreams of you, Thomas Brennan." The use of his name sent shock through Thomas like lightning. He'd never told Ayanna his name, hadn't spoken to her at all during that brief violent encounter 3 nights ago. But somehow she'd learned it, had asked questions, had spoken to her father about the white soldier who'd stood between her and harm. The realization that she'd been thinking about him, dreaming about him, filled him with a warmth that temporarily pushed back the fire in his back. Iron Bear smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of emotion he'd shown since arriving. "She is young, but she sees clearly. She sees a man worth 30 lashes, worth the anger of his own people, worth the risk of everything he holds dear. And she asks her father to offer what our people have never offered to a white man, a place in our family, a bond that cannot be broken by war or hatred or time." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his face a study in conflicting emotions. As a military man, he should refuse this offer immediately, should remind everyone present that fraternization with hostile tribes was strictly forbidden. But as a human being who had just witnessed 30 lashes administered for an act of basic decency, he found himself hesitating. The offer wasn't just about marriage. It was about the possibility of peace, of understanding between peoples who had known nothing but violence for generations. If a single act of courage could build a bridge across that chasm of hatred, what kind of man would he be to burn it down before it was even tested? The silence that followed Iron Bear's offer stretched like a boring pulled to its breaking point. Thomas hung from the post, his mind reeling between the crushing weight of his wounds and the impossible possibility that had just been laid before him. Around the compound, 200 soldiers stood frozen in a moment that would define not just one man's fate, but potentially the relationship between two peoples who had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember. Colonel Harrison's internal struggle played across his weathered features, like shadows dancing in firelight. Duty wearing with conscience. Military protocol battling against the recognition that some moments transcend regulations and demand choices that come from the heart rather than the handbook. Iron Bear waited with the infinite patience of a man who had spent decades negotiating the survival of his people through words rather than weapons. He understood that what he was asking went beyond military authority, beyond the simple exchange of prisoners or territory that usually defined interactions between his world and the white man's. He was asking for something that had never been attempted before, a bond of kinship that would make a white soldier part of a Lakota family, creating ties that no government could easily sever. The decorated pipe remained in his hands, its red stone surface gleaming in the morning sun like captured blood, a symbol of sacred promises that once made could never be unmade. Behind the chief, his two warriors sat their horses with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. But Thomas could sense their tension. They had followed their leader into the heart of enemy territory based on trust and loyalty. But this moment was testing even those bonds. One of them, a younger man with braided hair and scars across his cheek that spoke of battle survived, kept his hand near his weapon while his eyes swept the compound for signs of treachery. The other, older and bearing the weathered dignity of a veteran warrior, watched his chief with the focused attention of someone ready to act the instant. The situation turned deadly. Both men understood that their leader was gambling not just with his own life, but with the future of their people. Thomas tried to speak to respond to the incredible offer that had just transformed his world, but his throat was raw from the leather bit, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Iron Bear moved closer to the post, close enough to hear, and Thomas forced the words past his damaged vocal cords. "Your daughter, she barely knows me. How can she? How can you?" The chief's expression softened with something that might have been amusement or perhaps the recognition of a young man's bewilderment in the face of forces larger than himself. "You think 3 minutes of violence tells the whole story of a man's heart?" Iron Bear asked quietly. "My daughter sees what others miss. She sees the soldier who could have walked away, who could have let others handle the problem, who could have chosen safety over justice. The chief's voice carried a weight of conviction that cut through Thomas's pain-fog confusion. In those 3 minutes, you showed her more about your character than most men reveal in years of courtship. You showed her a heart that chooses right over easy, that protects the innocent, even when the cost is terrible. You showed her the kind of man she has been dreaming of since she was old enough to understand what honor means. Thomas felt tears mixing with the blood and sweat on his face. Not from physical pain, but from the overwhelming recognition that someone had seen him, truly seen him, in a moment when he'd acted purely from instinct, without thought for consequences or rewards. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat, the sound sharp enough to cut through the emotional intensity building around the whipping post. "Chief Iron Bear," he said carefully, "what proposing? It's not just a matter of military regulations. It's a matter of law, of policy set by Congress and the War Department. I don't have the authority to approve such an arrangement." The chief turned to face him, his weathered features settling into an expression of patient understanding. "I do not ask for your approval, Colonel. I ask only that you do not prevent it. The choice belongs to the young soldier and to my daughter. They are both old enough to decide their own fates." The distinction was crucial, and Harrison recognized it immediately. Iron Bear wasn't asking for official sanction or military blessing. He was simply asking for the space to make an offer, for the freedom to extend an invitation that transcended the boundaries of law and regulation. If Thomas chose to accept, if he chose to leave his military service and join the Lakota people through marriage to the chief's daughter, that would be his decision as a free man rather than as a soldier following orders. The colonel's jaw worked as he considered the implications, his mind racing through the potential consequences of allowing such an unprecedented situation to unfold. From somewhere beyond the compound gates came the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders moving at speed toward the fort. Harrison's attention snapped toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm as he considered the possibilities. More Lakota warriors coming to reinforce their chief. Government officials arriving to complicate an already impossible situation. The tension that had been building around the whipping post suddenly exploded outward to encompass the entire compound as soldiers moved into defensive positions, and Iron Bear's warriors shifted on their mounts, reading the change in atmosphere with the instincts of men who had survived countless encounters with danger. The gates swung open to admit a small cavalry patrol, their horses oldered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. The lieutenant in charge dismounted quickly, his eyes taking in the unprecedented scene before him. A Lakota chief standing peacefully among armed soldiers, a man hanging bloody from the whipping post, and an atmosphere charged with tension that felt ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. He approached Colonel Harrison with the quick, nervous movements of a man bearing bad news. And when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent compound. "Sir, we've got a situation developing 20 km south. 3 separate wagon trains attacked in the last 2 days. Families scattered, livestock stolen. The territorial governor is demanding immediate action, and there's talk of assembling a punitive expedition against any Lakota found in the area." The words hit like physical blows, and Thomas saw Iron Bear's face tight with the recognition that the delicate moment they had been building was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. The old chief had come here in peace, offering marriage and kinship, but the wider world was calling for war. Harrison's face went ashen as he processed the implications. With attacks mounting and political pressure building, the last thing he could afford was to be seen negotiating with Lakota leaders, no matter how peaceful their intentions. The lieutenant continued his report, his voice growing more urgent. "Sir, there's also word that Washington is sending a special investigator to review our handling of Native relations in this sector. Questions have been raised about our methods, our success rates, our..." His eyes flicked toward Thomas at the whipping post, then back to Harrison. "Our discipline procedures." The colonel's mouth tightened into a grim line. A federal investigator meant scrutiny of everything, including the current situation with Iron Bear and his impossible offer of marriage. If word reached Washington that he had allowed a Lakota chief to negotiate the marriage of his daughter to an American soldier, The political fallout would destroy not just his career, but potentially the entire command structure of the frontier army. Yet looking at Thomas, bloodied and broken, but somehow still radiating the stubborn integrity that had gotten him into this situation, Harrison found himself reluctant to simply dismiss what was happening here. Iron Bear seemed to sense the shifting dynamics, his keen political instincts recognizing that the window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He stepped closer to Colonel Harrison, his voice dropping to a tone that carried the weight of urgency without sacrificing dignity. "Colonel, I know the pressures you face from your government, the demands for action against my people, but I also know that some of those attacks were not done by Lakota hands. There are others, pawn raiders, white renegades who dress like Indians to hide their crimes, who would use this violence to destroy any chance of peace between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that made Harrison's jaw clench with frustration. False flag attacks designed to incite war were not unknown on the frontier, and the colonel had long suspected that some of the violence attributed to various tribes was actually the work of criminals who found profit in chaos. But proving such things was nearly impossible, and the political reality was that someone had to be blamed when wagon trains burned and families died. The Lakota, as the most visible and organized of the local tribes, made convenient targets for a government that needed simple answers to complex problems. "Even if that's true," Harrison said quietly, "it doesn't change the immediate situation. I have orders, Chief Iron Bear. I have responsibilities that go beyond what's happening in this compound right now." The old chief nodded, his expression showing that he understood the impossible position the colonel found himself in. But understanding didn't mean acceptance, and his next words carried the full weight of a father's determination to protect his daughter's happiness and his people's future. "Then let us act quickly before your responsibilities make choice impossible. Let me speak with the young soldier one more time. Let him decide his fate while decision is still possible." Thomas had been listening to the exchange through a haze of pain and growing desperation. The arrival of the patrol, the news of fresh attacks, the mention of federal investigators, all of it pointed toward the collapse of this fragile moment of possibility. But through it all, one thought burned clear in his mind. Jonna had dreamed of him, had asked her father to offer marriage to a man she barely knew because she'd seen something in him that he hadn't even recognized in himself. The carved bird with its blue and white beads seemed to pulse against his memory, a promise of love and acceptance that transcended the hatred and violence that defined this corner of the world. Iron Bear approached Thomas with the measured steps of a man who understood that the next few moments would determine not just the fate of his daughter's heart, but potentially the future of peace between two peoples standing on the edge of another bloody war. The compound had grown deathly quiet, every soldier and warrior present sensing that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and retold for generations, regardless of how it ended. Thomas lifted his head with tremendous effort, his vision swimming from blood loss and exhaustion, but his eyes clear with the desperate intensity of a man who knew he was about to face the most important decision of his life. The chief stopped just close enough that their conversation would remain private, his weathered hand reaching out to steady Thomas's swaying form. "Young soldier, I see death creeping at the edges of your eyes. These lashes have taken more from you than your commanders intended." His voice carried the gentle authority of a father speaking to a son, tinged with genuine concern that transcended tribal boundaries. "But before the darkness takes you, I need you to hear something that my daughter asked me to tell you, if this moment ever came." Thomas tried to nod, the movement sending fresh waves of agony down his spine, but his attention focused completely on Iron Bear's words, knowing that whatever Ayanna had said might be the last beautiful thing he ever heard. "She told me that in the 3 minutes you stood between her and those men, she saw the husband she had been praying for since she was old enough to understand what marriage meant." Iron Bear's voice grew softer, more intimate, as if he were sharing sacred secrets. "She said your eyes held no anger toward her people, only toward injustice. She said your hands were gentle when you helped her up from the dirt, careful not to touch where you shouldn't, respectful even in violence. She said you looked at her like she was a person worth protecting, not an object to be used or a problem to be solved." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, a dam of emotion he hadn't even realized he'd been holding back since that night. The chief continued, his dark eyes never leaving Thomas's battered face. But most importantly, she told me that when you smiled at her just before they dragged you away, she saw the man she wanted to grow old with. Not because you were strong enough to fight for her, but because you were brave enough to sacrifice everything for a stranger's dignity. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, but instead of pain, they brought a warmth that seemed to push back against the cold that was creeping into his limbs. Gianna had seen all of that in their brief encounter, had recognized something in him that he was only now beginning to understand about himself. From behind them came the sound of Colonel Harrison's sharp voice issuing orders to the patrol that had just arrived. Lieutenant Morrison, get your men fed and rested. We'll be riding out at first light to investigate these attacks and send word to Fort Laramie. I want to know everything about this federal investigator before he arrives. The military efficiency of the commands provided a stark contrast to the deeply personal conversation taking place at the whipping post, highlighting the collision between institutional demands and individual choices that was playing out in real time. Iron Bear's expression tightened slightly as he recognized that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Thomas Brennan, the chief said, using his full name with the formal gravity of a man about to offer something sacred. My daughter has asked me to bring you an offer that has never been extended to a white man in the history of our people. She wishes to know if you would consider leaving your soldier's life to become her husband, to join our family, not as a captive or a curiosity, but as a son and a warrior worthy of respect. The chief paused, letting the magnitude of the offer sink in before continuing. She understands what this would cost you, your uniform, your country, your place among your own people, but she believes that what she offers in return might be worth more than what you would lose. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling tears mixed with the blood and sweat on his cheeks as he grappled with the possible choice being laid before him. Everything he had ever known, everyone he had ever been would disappear if he accepted Ayanna's offer. The United States Army would declare him a deserter. His family back in Ohio would consider him dead to them, and he would become a man without a country in the truest sense. But against that loss, he weighed the memory of gentle hands tending his wounds, of eyes that saw honor where others saw only reckless stupidity, of a girl who had dreamed about a stranger because she recognized in him the capacity for love that transcended hatred. What? What would happen to her if I said no? Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible even to Iron Bear, who was standing so close. The chief's expression grew grave, his weathered features settling into lines of paternal sorrow. She would accept it as she accepts all things that cannot be changed. She would marry someone from our own people eventually, have children, live a good life. But she would always wonder about the white soldier who chose honor over safety, who showed her that love can exist even between enemies. The image of Ayanna spending her life wondering what if was almost unbearable to contemplate, adding another layer of weight to an already impossible decision. Behind them, the compound continued its transformation back into a military installation rather than the stage for a cross-cultural drama. Soldiers were returning to their duties. The patrol was being debriefed, and the machinery of frontier warfare was grinding back into motion. But Iron Bear's two warriors remained mounted and alert, their presence a reminder that this moment existed in a fragile bubble of peace that could burst at any moment. The older warrior caught his chief's eye and made a subtle gesture toward the sun, indicating that time was growing short if they hoped to return to their own territory before dark. Iron Bear seemed to read his warrior's signal, his voice taking on a note of gentle urgency. I cannot give you long to decide, young soldier. My presence here grows more dangerous with each moment that passes. Already there will be those among your people who see treachery in my peaceful approach, just as there are those among mine who see weakness in my offer of kinship to a white man. He reached into his pouch and withdrew the leather-wrapped bundle containing the ceremonial pipe, holding it where Thomas could see it clearly. This pipe has sealed treaties and ended wars. It has blessed marriages and bound families together across generations. If you choose to accept my daughter's offer, we will smoke it together, and you will become my son in the eyes of the spirits and the people. The weight of tradition and ceremony, in the chief's words, was overwhelming, representing not just a marriage proposal, but an adoption into a culture and a people who would become Thomas's entire world. He tried to imagine himself living in a Lakota village, learning their language and customs, hunting buffalo instead of drilling with cavalry units, raising children who would be caught between two worlds just as he would be. The image was both terrifying and strangely compelling, offering a life of purpose and meaning that his military service had never quite provided. "Chief Iron Bear," Thomas managed to say, his voice growing stronger as he found the words he needed to express what was in his heart. "Your daughter Jana, she saved my soul that night just as surely as I tried to protect her body. I've been thinking about her every moment since they dragged me away, wondering if I'd ever see her again, if she was safe, if she understood why I had to act." He paused, gathering strength for what might be the most important words he would ever speak. "I've been in love with her since the moment she pressed that carved bird into my hand, even though I barely know her name or the sound of her voice. I've been dreaming of a life I never thought possible with a woman who saw something in me that I'm still trying to understand." The chief's stern features softened into something approaching a smile, the first genuine expression of joy Thomas had seen from him since his arrival. "Then you accept. You will leave your soldier's life to become my daughter's husband, my son, a member of our family and our people." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that would reshape not just Thomas's future, but potentially the relationship between the Lakota and the military forces that had been their enemies for so long. Thomas felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the recognition that his answer would ripple outward in ways he couldn't possibly predict. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment once again. This time, however, the riders were not military patrols, but a small group of Lakota women, their horses decorated with ribbons and their clothing adorned with the fine beadwork that marked them as members of a chief's family. At the center of the group rode a young woman whose beauty struck Thomas like a physical blow, even through his pain and exhaustion. Jana sat her horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, her long black hair braided with blue and white beads that matched the decoration on the carved bird she'd given him. Her eyes found his immediately across the compound, and in that gaze Thomas saw everything he needed to know about his future. Jana's arrival transformed the compound's atmosphere from tense military standoff to something that felt almost mystical, as if the spirits themselves had conspired to bring together two hearts that belonged to different worlds. She dismounted with fluid grace despite the formal riding dress she wore, a stunning creation of soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire. The other women with her formed a respectful semicircle, their presence adding weight and ceremony to what was already an unprecedented moment in the history of this frontier outpost. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat as she approached, her dark eyes never leaving his face, reading there the pain and exhaustion, but also something deeper that made her lips curve in the smallest of smiles. Colonel Harrison watched the developing scene with the expression of a man who had completely lost control of his command military protocol, dissolving in the face of forces that transcended regulations and rank structure. The arrival of Lakota women at his fort was unprecedented enough, but their obvious ceremonial dress and the reverent way they flanked Iron Bear's daughter suggested that this was no casual visit. His mind raced through the potential consequences. Federal investigators, territorial governors, newspaper reporters who would sensationalize any story involving romance between soldiers and Indian women. Yet something in Ayana's bearing, in the dignity with which she approached the bloody whipping post, where Thomas hung barely conscious, made it impossible for him to simply order them all to leave. Jana stopped just close enough to Thomas that she could see the extent of his injuries, her face showing the controlled composure of a woman who had been preparing herself for this moment since her father rode away that morning. But her eyes betrayed the depth of her emotion, pain at seeing him suffer, gratitude that he had survived, and something else that Thomas recognized as the same love that had been growing in his own heart since their first meeting. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone speaking in a second language, about matters that touched her soul. I asked my father to wait to let me see you before you gave your answer. I needed to look in your eyes again to be certain that what I saw that night was real. Thomas tried to straighten against the post to show her that despite the blood and pain, he was still the man who had stood between her and harm. The effort sent fresh agony through his torn back, but he managed to meet her gaze directly, letting her see everything he felt written in his features. Ayanna, he whispered, her name feeling like a prayer on his lips. I've been dreaming of you every moment since they dragged me away. Dreaming of your hands, your eyes, the way you saw something in me that I didn't even know was there. His voice grew stronger as the words flowed out. 3 days of pent-up emotion, finally finding expression. I've been wondering if I'd ever see you again, if I'd ever get the chance to tell you that 3 minutes changed everything about who I am and who I want to become. The young woman stepped closer, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his face if propriety had allowed such contact. Instead, she reached into a beaded pouch at her waist and withdrew something that made Thomas's heart leap with recognition. The carved bird he had given back to her, now hanging from an elaborate necklace of blue and white beads, interwoven with small silver bells that chimed softly in the afternoon breeze. I have carried this with me every day since that night, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent compound. Not just the bird, but the memory of hands that protected instead of harmed, eyes that held no hatred, a heart brave enough to choose suffering over silence. She held the necklace where he could see it clearly, the carved bird seeming to dance in the shifting light, as the silver bells created a gentle music that somehow made the harsh military setting feel transformed into something sacred. Among my people, Jana continued, her voice taking on the formal cadence of someone reciting important cultural traditions. When a woman wishes to show that a man has captured her heart, she creates something beautiful with her own hands and offers it as a symbol of her feelings. This necklace represents 60 hours of work. Every bead chosen and placed with thoughts of you. Every stitch made while I prayed to the spirits that you would survive long enough to receive it. The revelation that she had spent so many hours creating something specifically for him, thinking of him while her fingers worked the intricate patterns, moved Thomas to tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. Through the haze of blood loss and exhaustion, he saw with perfect clarity what his life could become. Not the lonely existence of a career soldier moving from posting to posting, but a life of love and purpose with a woman who understood the deepest parts of his character. Jana, he said, putting everything he felt into her name. I accept your father's offer, your offer, the chance to become part of your family and your people. I choose love over duty, heart over habit, you over everything I've ever known. Iron Bear's stern features broke into the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from him, the expression transforming his weathered face and revealing the proud father beneath the diplomatic chief. He stepped forward with the ceremonial pipe, unwrapping it with movements that spoke of rituals performed countless times across generations of his people. Then it is settled, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the compound and causing a stir among the assembled soldiers, who realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of white Indian relations. Thomas Brennan, you will be cut down from this post, not as a punished soldier, but as a man about to join a new family through marriage to my daughter. Colonel Harrison found himself caught between military duty and human decency, watching as the impossible situation unfolded beyond his ability to control or contain it. Protocol demanded that he refuse to allow such an arrangement, that he complete Thomas's punishment and maintain the strict separation between his soldiers and the local tribes. But something in the dignity of Iron Bear's proposal, in the obvious love between Thomas and Ayanna, made him reluctant to destroy what was clearly a moment of profound personal and cultural significance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making a decision that would define the rest of his career. Private Brennan, if you accept this offer, you understand that it means the end of your military service. You'll be discharged immediately with no benefits, no pension, no claim to any support from the United States government. Thomas nodded as firmly as his condition allowed, his eyes never leaving as he made the commitment that would reshape his entire existence. I understand, sir, and I accept those consequences gladly. Harrison studied him for a long moment, then turned to his sergeant with orders that would be remembered long after both men were gone. Sergeant Williams cut Private Brennan down from that post. His punishment is complete, and his service to the United States Army is hereby terminated by his own choice. The sergeant moved quickly to comply, his knife sawing through the ropes that had held Thomas upright through 30 lashes in the most important conversation of his life. As Thomas collapsed to his knees, Ayanna was there immediately, her gentle hands supporting him as his strength finally gave out completely. The touch of her skin against his was electric, confirming everything he had hoped and dreamed about their connection during the long hours of his imprisonment. She whispered something in Lakota, words he didn't understand but felt in his bones anyway, then switched to English for the benefit of the watching crowd. "I have dreamed of this moment," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder and joy. "Dreamed of the day when the brave soldier would become my husband, when two peoples could be joined by love instead of divided by hatred." Iron Bear knelt beside them, the ceremonial pipe cradled in his weathered hands as he prepared to perform a ritual that had never been attempted between a Lakota and a white man. "This pipe has blessed the marriages of 7 generations of my family," he explained, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ceremony. "Today it will bless something new, a union that bridges 2 worlds, creating bonds that no government can break and no war can destroy." He offered the pipe to Thomas first, guiding his trembling hands as he took the ritual puffs that would seal his commitment to Ayanna and her people. As the sacred smoke rose into the afternoon sky, Thomas felt something fundamental shift in his soul. The man who had been dragged to the whipping post as Private Thomas Brennan was gone, replaced by someone new, a husband, a son, a bridge between worlds that had known only conflict for too long. Jana took her turn with the pipe, her eyes shining with tears of joy as she completed the ritual that made them officially married in the eyes of her people and the spirits that watched over them. The silver bells on her necklace chimed softly in the breeze, creating music that seemed to celebrate not just their union, but the possibility that love might indeed prove stronger than hatred. The compound erupted in a mixture of cheers and confused murmurs as soldiers tried to process what they had just witnessed, while Iron Bear's warriors began a traditional song of celebration that echoed off the wooden buildings like a promise of better days to come. Thomas, supported by his new wife's gentle strength and surrounded by the family he had chosen over everything else, felt the pain of his wounds fade beside the overwhelming joy of knowing that he had found his place in the world at last. As the sun began to set over the frontier outpost, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the carved bird with its blue and white beads seemed to dance in the light, a symbol of love that had conquered fear and built bridges across the deepest divides of race and culture. Colonel Harrison watched the celebration with conflicted emotions, knowing that he would spend years explaining this day to his superiors, but unable to deny that he had witnessed something remarkable, proof that even in the harshest corners of an unforgiving world, love could find a way to triumph over hatred, and honor could create bonds stronger than any military regulation or government policy could ever hope to break. 3 months had passed since the ceremony that bound Thomas Brennan to a world he was still learning to understand. The Lakota camp stretched along the banks of the Powder River like a living thing. Tipis arranged in careful patterns that spoke of traditions older than memory. Thomas sat cross-legged outside the lodge he now shared with Ayanna, his hands working slowly at the intricate beadwork she was teaching him, each stitch a meditation on how completely his life had changed. The scars on his back had healed into raised lines that told their own story, but the man who bore them was no longer the soldier who had taken 30 lashes for a stranger's honor. He was Wassen Hin Waste, good intention, the name Iron Bear had given him during the adoption ceremony that made him truly part of the people. Jana emerged from their lodge carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deer hide, her movements careful and deliberate in a way that had become familiar over the past weeks. Thomas looked up from his beadwork, his heart catching as he saw the gentle curve of her belly beneath her dress, the unmistakable signs of the life they had created together. She settled beside him with the graceful motion of a woman who had grown up moving with the rhythms of the natural world, her dark eyes bright with the secret joy they had been sharing for weeks now. When she unwrapped the bundle, Thomas saw that she had been working on tiny moccasins, each one decorated with the same blue and white pattern that had adorned the carved bird necklace she still wore every day. "Child will need strong feet for the journey ahead," she said softly, her English now peppered with Lakota words that Thomas was slowly learning to understand. The baby was due in the depth of winter, when the tribe would be settled in their protected valley, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of survival and celebration that had sustained the people through countless generations. Thomas reached out to touch one of the tiny moccasins, marveling at the delicate craftsmanship and the love that had gone into every stitch. In his former life, children had been an abstract concept, something that might happen someday in a future he had never quite been able to imagine. Now, with Ayana's hand resting on his arm and their unborn child growing between them, the future felt both terrifyingly real and impossibly precious. The sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful afternoon quiet, and Thomas looked up to see a familiar figure riding into camp. Colonel Harrison sat his horse with military precision, but his face showed none of the stern authority that had once defined their relationship. Instead, he looked like a man carrying news he wished he didn't have to deliver. Iron Bear emerged from his own lodge, moving with the diplomatic grace that had made him such an effective leader, and the two men who had once negotiated across the barrel of a gun now greeted each other with the careful respect of former enemies who had found common ground. Harrison dismounted and approached the lodge where Thomas and Ayana sat, his weathered features showing the strain of months spent defending his decision to allow an unprecedented marriage between his former soldier and a Lakota chief's daughter. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had been fighting battles on multiple fronts. "Thomas, I need to speak with you. There have been developments that affect your situation and possibly your safety." The formal tone couldn't hide the genuine concern in the colonel's eyes, and Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching autumn weather. Iron Bear joined them, settling into the circle with the easy dignity that made him such a natural leader, and Harrison continued his explanation with the careful precision of a military briefing. "The federal investigator I mentioned has completed his review of frontier operations. His report is critical of certain aspects of our relationship with local tribes. More specifically, it questions the wisdom of allowing personal relationships to develop between military personnel and tribal members." Thomas felt Ayana's hand tighten on his arm, her intuitive understanding of English politics sharp enough to recognize the threat hidden in Harrison's carefully chosen words. The colonel's jaw tightened as he delivered the rest of his news. "There's pressure from Washington to regularize the situation. Some officials are suggesting that your marriage should be declared invalid under federal law, that you should be brought back into military custody as a deserter who was unduly influenced by enemy agents." The words hung in the air like poison, threatening to destroy everything Thomas and Ayana had built together in their months of happiness. Iron Bear's expression remained carefully neutral, but Thomas could see the anger burning in his dark eyes, the recognition that white man's law was once again being used to attack what his people held sacred. Thomas felt rage building in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him to stand between Ayana and harm 3 months ago. But before he could speak, his wife's gentle voice cut through the tension with words that showed how much she had grown to understand the complexities of the world her marriage had thrust her into. "They would take my husband from me because they cannot accept that love can exist between our peoples," she said quietly, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly where their child grew. "They would call our marriage invalid because it proves that their hatred is not the only choice." Harrison's face showed the internal struggle of a man caught between duty and conscience, between the demands of his superiors and the recognition that what he was witnessing represented something precious and fragile that deserved protection. "I won't let that happen," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of a career soldier who had decided to make his stand on ground of his own choosing. "Your marriage was witnessed by federal officers, conducted according to the religious customs of a sovereign people, and consummated with the full knowledge and consent of both parties. Any attempt to declare it invalid would require overturning legal precedents that go back to the founding of this country." The colonel's unexpected support brought tears to eyes, but Thomas could see that Harrison wasn't finished with his news. The older man's expression grew even more grave as he continued. However, there is another complication. The territorial governor has issued what amounts to an ultimatum. Either you return to military custody voluntarily, or bounty hunters will be authorized to bring you back by force. The charge would be desertion in time of war, which carries serious consequences. The euphemism couldn't hide the reality that Thomas was potentially facing execution, that his choice to follow his heart instead of military regulations had painted a target on his back that would never fully disappear. Iron Bear spoke for the first time since Harrison's arrival, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent decades protecting his people from exactly this kind of governmental overreach. And what of my daughter? What of the child she carries? Are they to be considered legitimate spoils of this white man's justice, or will they be cast aside as inconvenient complications? The chief's words cut straight to the heart of the matter, highlighting the human cost of political decisions made by men who would never face the consequences of their choices. Harrison's face showed genuine pain as he grappled with questions that had no good answers. I don't know, he admitted, his military bearing cracking under the weight of moral complexity. The law is unclear about the status of children born to such unions. There are precedents that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the political needs of whoever is making the decision. The uncertainty was almost worse than a definitive threat, leaving Thomas and Ayanna to imagine dozens of possible futures, none of them offering the simple happiness they had found in each other's arms. As if summoned by the gravity of the conversation, other members of the tribe began to gather around their lodge. Warriors who had initially been skeptical of the white man in their midst now stood ready to defend him as family. Women who had taught Ayanna the songs and stories of their people now offered the same wisdom to the child she carried, regardless of its mixed heritage. Children who had learned to see Thomas not as an enemy, but as an uncle who told fascinating stories about the world beyond their valley, now played at his feet. Their laughter a reminder that love could indeed transcend the artificial boundaries that adults insisted on drawing. Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him, his wife, his father-in-law, his adopted people, and the military commander who had become an unlikely ally, and felt the weight of decisions settling on his shoulders once again. 3 months ago, he had chosen love over duty, heart over regulation, hope over fear. Now he was being asked to make that choice again, with even higher stakes and even less certainty about the outcome. But as Ayanna's hand found his, as their unborn child moved beneath her touch, as the silver bells on her necklace chimed softly in the evening breeze, Thomas knew that some choices once made with a full heart could never be unmade. The carved bird that had started it all seemed to dance in the firelight, a symbol of love that had already survived 30 lashes, military regulations, and the prejudices of 2 worlds. Whatever came next, whatever price they would be asked to pay for choosing each other, Thomas and Ayanna would face it together, their bonds stronger than any law, and their love deeper than any hatred the world could throw against them.